I put it out there. Did you guys want me to make a video on the individual histories of the Factory Boss 302 Trans-Am Mustangs? And the response was pretty positive, so here goes. Plus, I'll throw in a bonus car at the end of part 2 if you manage to hang around for that long. Now we'll do this in order of VIN numbers, and with current owners, unless they're currently racing with the historic Trans-Am group, whereby their ownership is public knowledge, then I won't name names just for privacy reasons. Now hopefully you watched my recent Anorak numbers video on these cars. And if you didn't, I'd suggest checking that one out first, otherwise this one here might not make much sense. Hopefully a little link will appear somewhere up here. Anyway, I will split this into 2 parts because you've got better things to do with your life than listen to me blathering on for hours. So here goes. Now I should say first of all, I am not 100% clear on which driver drove what car in each individual race throughout the 1969 Trans-Am. You see, the factory Trans-Am Mustangs were like musical chairs, and especially the Shelby cars. No driver appears to have been designated a specific car and then stuck with it. Remember, there was no Trans-Am Drivers' Championship, there was only a Manufacturers' Championship. And the factory Ford teams had a whole pool of drivers at their disposal, and they basically pluck one off the shelf and plug them into a car. That said, Parnelli Jones and George Fulmer did the bulk of the driving for Budmore Engineering, and Peter Revson and Horst Queck did the bulk of the driving for Shelby Racing Company. So I'll just do the best that I can. Now, this was the very first 69 Boss 302 factory racer built, and it's sometimes referred to as the carcraft prototype. You see, it's one of 3 complete cars from Carcraft, and it was assigned to Shelby Racing Co. Now, Fran Hernandez headed the Ford Factory Trans-Am program, and he had this beautiful collection of photos of the Carcraft prototype taken at Carcraft in December 1968. Now, I don't know if Fran took the photos himself, but he had them in his possession, and they've since passed on to his son Randy, and Randy has kindly allowed me to share them here. Now, even though this was the first car built, it appears it didn't actually have its first race until round 6 of the 69 Trans-Am at Briar. It was driven by Horst Queck in round 7 of the series at Circuit Mont-Tremblant, or Saint-Gervais. And it was involved in the big wreck caused by George Fulmer blowing his motor in his Budmore Mustang and laying down an oil slick. And the crash actually took out 3 of the 4 factory Mustangs in the race. Now 073 was repaired and it contested the last few rounds of the 69 Championship and was driven by Dan Gurney at Laguna Seca and Kent. And when Ford dropped to one team for 1970, 073 went to Bud Moore and was eventually updated as a 1970 model. But Moore never actually raced the car, and it was eventually sold to John Gimble of Dark Horse Racing for the 1971 season. It was painted black, and at various times it had both red and blue stripes. It went to Daya Enterprise Racing, and then in the late 1970s to Danny Moore, and he contested the SCCA runoffs in the car at least a couple of times. It went through a couple more owners and was eventually restored as the 1969 Carcraft Shelby prototype. Don Dimitriadis owned and raced the Boss for many years, but it's now owned by Bill Byrne. It runs with the historic Trans-Am group and is presented as the Dan Gurney car with the number 2 on the door. The second prototype and the second complete Carcraft Boss went to Budmore Engineering. It was used for early publicity photos with the team's 2 regular drivers of Parnelli Jones and George Fulmer. Now, because Jones used the number 15 as the lead driver, Fulmer had to stand in front of the door number, so it looked like there were 2 different cars. But the truth is, the others hadn't actually been finished yet. Now, this was also the first factory Boss 302 to be raced. Parnelli Jones drove it in the 1969 Citrus 250 at Daytona Speedway in February. Now, this was actually a NASCAR Grand Touring race and not a Trans-Am. Bud Moore ran his Trans-Am Mercury Cougars in Grand Touring in 1968, and it was sort of like a Trans-Am series but on Speedway ovals. Anyway, Jones took pole and was leading the race, but he ultimately retired. 074 was then driven by George Fulmer in the first half of the 1969 Trans-Am. He won at Bridgehampton, but of course his motor blew in round 6 at Saint-Gervais, which caused the multi-car pileup and took out a chunk of the Ford fleet. That basically ended Chassis 074's career, but it stayed at Bud Moore's workshop until it was purchased in 1982 by Richard Rodeck. Now he started the restoration and the next owner, Don Hodges, finished it. It's since passed through various different owners and is now owned by Jeff O'Neill, who runs it in the historic Trans-Am group as the Parnelli Jones car. This was another Bud Moore car which George Follmer drove in the second half of the '69 season. Now he drove it in 5 races I believe before wrecking it famously in the Riverside final. Now he was leading the race when a wheel broke. He came barreling into the pits on 3 wheels, and as he hit the brakes, the car veered hard right into the pit wall. And that was the end of its Trans-Am career, but Bud Moore kept it. Now it apparently sat out the back of his shop in the bushes along with Chassis 074 until it too was purchased by Richard Rodeck. And it was restored in the mid-1990s as George Follmer's car. Now as its longtime owner, Vic Edelbrock Jr. raced Chassis 623 with the historic Trans-Am group until his passing in 2017, but the car is in safe hands. This car was originally assigned to Bud Moore but was then gifted to Alan Moffat by Jacques Pacino to race in Australia. Now Canadian-born Moffat had spent some time in Australia and he wanted to return there. Now as he was part of Ford's racing program, he visited Pacino in February of 1969 and he was hoping to score one of the retired 1968 notchbacks. But in the end, Pacino sent Moffat to Bud Moore's shop to finish and ship Chassis 624. Now it was actually sent to Australia with a 1968 Tunnel Port 302, but this was soon replaced with the correct Boss 302. Moffat raced the Mustang from 1969 until early 1975, and he ran the car in the Australian Touring Car Championship and the Aussie Sports Sedan Championship. And it was replaced by a factory Capri RS 3100, which I also featured on this channel a while back, and which you can find on here if you're interested. Now Moffat should have won the 1971 Australian Touring Car Championship with the Boss. He and arch rival Bob Jane had been slugging it out all season, and Jane ultimately took the title by 6 points. But Moffat had been disqualified from round 3 of the series for ignoring a black flag while he was leading. He actually pitted on the last lap and the car was checked and cleared, and he took off again and still finished first. But he was later disqualified, and the 9 points that he lost as a result is what cost him the title. But regardless, this was a really successful car and it won about 2/3 of the races that it started. And even though it's a Trans-Am car, it never actually ran to Trans-Am specs. You see, Moffat fitted 4 2-barrel Webers and from 1970 ran 10-inch wide wheels. And the Aussie series allowed bigger engines than the Trans-Am, like for example Bob Jane's Camaro was a genuine ZL1 with an alloy block 427. Now Moffat tried a fuel-injected 351 from his Super Falcon, but he found that it threw out the delicate balance of the car, so he reverted back to his Boss 302. Now this car was unique for 2 reasons. First, Moffat was the only person who ever raced it. He retired the car in early 1975 and he kept it for years before eventually selling it to David Bowden in Queensland. It's basically unrestored and is almost completely original other than the paint. And secondly, all the early carcraft Mustangs had a 2-inch droop in the nose. Now this involved cutting 2 inches from the radiator support panel and tapering it back through the inner fenders. You see, the idea was to get the front spoiler as close to the ground as possible, but without sacrificing suspension travel, and still covering the 4-inch ground clearance rule. And it also made the cars a little bit more aerodynamic. Now all the factory Trans-Am teams were doing this by 1969, but the Ford and Chevy teams were by far the worst. A former racer Walt Hayne was an SCCA tech inspector in 1969, and he told a great story about how he could see that the Mustang bodies had been manipulated. And of course this was totally illegal. They had to retain a stock profile. He spoke to Bud Moore about this, and Bud said, "Show me what I did." And you know what? He couldn't. It was so well executed. Anyway, they figured it out in the end, and all the factory cars were semi-restored with a 1-inch droop just to appease the SCCA. But Moffat's car was already over in Australia by this stage and its droop was never picked up there, so it's the only carcraft Mustang to retain its original 2-inch droop. Now, chassis 624 is still with the Bowden family, and it's one of the most celebrated historic racing cars in Australia. This was the fourth car assigned to Bud Moore from the early batch, and it was driven mostly by Parnelli Jones throughout the 1969 Trans Am, except for the last two races, and he took wins at Michigan and Donnybrook. At the end of the season, it was sent to Frank Gardner in England at the request of Walter Hayes. Now, Gardner had been driving for Alan Mann Racing, but when Mann shut down his operation at the end of '69, Ford wanted to keep Gardner on its books. The Boss was updated with a 1970 nose, but it retained its '69 Bud Moore colour scheme. Now, the British Saloon Car Championship ran to FIA Group 2 regulations, and it allowed for bigger engines and wider wheels than the Trans Am. But Gardner only ever raced the car with a Boss 302. Now, he won 8 races outright, but still lost the championship. You see, the BSCC rewarded race results for each class rather than outright results, and there were 4 classes, all based on engine size. And Bill McGovern, driving a Hillman Imp in the 1000cc class, scored more class points, and therefore he was the champion. So, yeah. Anyway, in late 1970, the Mustang was shipped to South Africa and then to Australia, which is where Gardner hailed from. But as it was being unloaded from the boat in Australia, it was dropped and it suffered severe damage. It was sort of roughly repaired and it became a speedway car in Australia. It got pretty beat up, but it was eventually bought by David Bowden, who also owns the Moffat car, as mentioned earlier. And it's slowly being restored back to its 1969 Bud Moore Trans Am guise. This was the third complete carcraft Boss, and it was built at the request of Seaman Bunky Knudsen for Smokey Yunick. And it was built as a Trans Am car in Smokey's beautiful black and gold colours. Now, Smokey was apparently going to run it in the Trans Am, but then Knudsen apparently requested that he convert it to a NASCAR Grand Touring car instead. Now, Smokey carried out a bunch of mods, as you'd expect, and these included fitting a steering box and idler arm from a right-hand drive Australian Falcon, and this provided extra clearance so that he could build some epic exhaust headers. The Boss was driven by Bunky Blackburn at the very first race held at the new Talladega International Speedway, which was owned by Bill France. And he took pole and he was blitzing the field, but then a broken rocker took him out of the race. Now, Smokey was only with Ford for a very short amount of time before both he and Knudsen were shown the door, so that Talladega event was the only race that it did in his ownership. He sold it to Ed Rose, who ran it on short track speedways. Rusty Mahan was the next owner, and he kept it for years before selling it to Ross Myers, and he had it restored back as the original Smokey Yunick Trans Am car. Now, even though it has no actual Trans Am race history, it does run with the historic Trans Am group, and it's now owned by Ken Adams. You know, it's amazing. Most old speedway cars got wrecked, so it's a miracle that this car actually survived. Now, this car had the shortest history of all the factory Boss Mustangs. It was assigned to Shelby Racing Company, and it was driven by Horst Quick in the first round of the 1969 Trans Am. Now, this race was held at Michigan International Speedway, which had a sort of convoluted layout using parts of the banked oval, parts of the infield, and a sort of a road course outside of the banked oval. And it rained heavily right before the start of the race. Now, on lap 8, Quick went off the track into the infield. It's not clear if he spun or if he was hit, but he slid across the wet grass and through a retaining fence and into a spectator's car. And tragically, the spectator was killed and several others were injured. The chassis 627 suffered massive damage and it was sent to the Holman Moody shop in North Carolina, where it was stored in their old hangar. Now, this place housed several retired Ford factory racers, but there were also a few cars there with tragic stories attached to them. Now, when Ford got out of racing at the end of 1970, all the stuff was gifted to Holman Moody, so it's assumed that the Boss was scrapped. 628 was assigned to Shelby and was driven in the first part of the 69 season by Peter Revson. But Horst Quick was driving 628 in round 5 at Donnybrook, and he crashed. That meant it missed the Saint-Jovite wreck because it was being repaired, so it was cobbled back together for the next round at Watkins Glen. And by now, Shelby were running out of cars. Remember, they started the season with 4 cars, but chassis 628 was the only Shelby entry at Watkins Glen, and Horst Queck had to sit that one out. Now, Peter Revson drove it in the remaining 1969 races as the number 1 car. And at the end of the season, chassis 628 went to Bud Moore and it was updated as a 1970 model. Now, it looks to have served as a backup car for a time, but I'm not sure that it actually raced. According to the guru Wolfgang Korn, this might have been the car that AJ Foyt wrecked in practice at Saint-Jovite. Anyway, it was repaired and sold to the Troy Promotions team in 1971. This was the former Owens Corning Fiberglass team headed by Tony DiLorenzo and Jerry Thompson. Thompson drove chassis 628 in the 1971 Trans-Am. Now, I'm not too sure on its history throughout the second half of the 1970s, but in the mid-1980s, then owner Brooke Mosgrove carried out a restoration to 1969 Shelby guys. The car has run with the historic Trans-Am group over the years, including with Jim Click, but I'm not sure if it's running with them currently. This one also had a short career. Now, Sam Posey did a one-off race with Shelby at Lime Rock while Revson was away at Indianapolis. And driving chassis 629, he went and won the race. And that was a highlight for Shelby in 1969. Revson was driving it at Saint-Jovite and he was caught up in the big wreck. The tub was apparently bent and it was sent back to Carcraft for repairs. But with several of the factory Boss 302s having been smashed, it appears it was never rebuilt. It's believed parts were fitted to other cars and parts of the body were used to repair chassis 628 in 1970. Either way, it hasn't resurfaced and so it's assumed gone. So that's it for part 1. We've covered 9 cars and we'll cover another 8 in part 2, which is the 1970 and 71 cars, including the bonus car. Now, if you have more in-depth knowledge on exactly what driver drove what car in each race in 1969, or if you can fill in some of the other gaps, feel free to reach out. Anyway, that's it for this episode, guys. Thank you so much for watching. I really do appreciate you tuning in. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and hit that little bell thingy down below so you'll get a notification when I post up a new video. Anyway, we will catch you next time. Thank you so much again. Take care. Bye-bye.